I'm trying to make sure I got all my stuff ready. Um, there's a series of articles that was released this week. Right now, it's 10:19 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, March 26, 2016. And the articles were by a well-known, credible, and respected, remember those three things, boxing writer by the name of Thomas Hauser. Um, in this day and age of technology, social media, and the internet, boxing fans, okay, let me say this, people in general are not reading as much as they used to. They would rather have things told to them or verbalized for them. It's just the way of the ages. So a lot of Thomas Hauser's previous works are not really recognized today because of not really recognized by the mainstream today because of the decline of readers, I should say. I don't want to get too deep, but basically the point I'm trying to make is people who read, like for example, magazines. People are buying less and less magazines each year. Books. People are buying less and less books each year, especially when you got smartphones where you can watch, you can read them on your smartphones. When it comes to radio, people are listening to the radio less and less. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, this guy is not just a guy who is just a guy. When he writes something as deep as this, he put a lot of research into it. Also, he's the same guy who talked about the Floyd Mayweather IV Gate scandal, in which he provided some pretty credible shit. One thing you can say, a couple of things you can say about him is, I understand how you can question his objectivity because he's paid by HBO as a consultant. He has multiple things that he does, but one of his revenue streams is from HBO. He also, when it comes to Floyd Mayweather, has shown that he's not a big Floyd Mayweather fan. Floyd Mayweather is managed and advised by Al Haymon. But what we're going to talk about is when it comes to these series of articles, we're going to talk about what it talks about, like the things you should know, the things you want to know, and the shit you don't want to know. For example, Al Haymon used to have a big afro. Who cares? Al Haymon used to have a whole lot of platform shoes. It was the 70s with glitter and shit all on them. Who cares, right? He drinks cranberry juice with club soda. Who cares, right? He only answers his phone when he wants to. That's regular shit. But what the article really talked about is, like the basis of it is basically how this man just took over the sport of boxing, and pretty much how his PBC plan, the vision of what he wants PBC to be, is failing. Now let me say this. I want good fights. I'm a PBC fan. I'm a supporter of Premier Boxing Champions. I'm not a supporter of all Premier Boxing Champions fights. Some of that shit I don't want to see. For example, we got Anthony Durrell versus Caleb Truax. Why? We got Danny Garcia versus Paulie Malignaggi. Why? We got Keith Thurman versus Luis Collazo. Why? We got Adonis Stevenson versus Tommy fucking Carpincy. Why? You see what I'm saying? It's like this. Al Haymon fighters, and we're going to get into the article, we're going to dissect each one by one. Al Haymon fighters they have a reputation of being protected. It's almost like it's this shield this invisible shield around all Al Haymon fighters, where they don't understand, or it doesn't come clear to them that fans look at them differently than fighters that are different than Al Haymon fighters. Now, not all Al Haymon fighters are the same. For example, you got guys like Sean Porter, who seems as though he would take big fights whenever a fight against anybody. You got fighters like Amir Khan, who has seemed to have broken all the rules of this Haymon era when he's fighting on HBO pay-per-view against Canelo Alvarez. It seems as though the fighters don't understand that even though you're making a lot of money, many Al Haymon fighters are making $1 million a fight, at least $1 million a fight, but they're not fighting against big level names. So fans see this, for example, with Keith Thurman versus Sean Porter. Allegedly, Keith Thurman wants more money. Now, Keith Thurman made somewhere around, I forgot the exact numbers, but he made more than 1.2 million, no, 1.3 or 1.5 million, I forgot, to fight Luis Collazo. But then he was allegedly issued a bonus check of 1.2 million, making it that he made about 3 million or so, 3 million or so to fight Luis Collazo. So when it comes to Sean Porter negotiations, word is, whether it's true or not, we don't know, that Keith Thurman has been holding out for more money, which is why the fight has taken so long to get finalized until March the 12th. Now, Keith Thurman was in a car accident. He did get some whiplash. From my understanding, it was a legitimate injury, and they pushed the fight back. But before, fans were wondering, why was the fight taking so long to negotiate? Keith Thurman allegedly wanted more money to fight Sean Porter because I guess he feels, as he should. I mean, it makes sense that, well, if I fight Luis Collazo and make around $3 million, then I should make around $4 to $5 million if I fight Sean Porter. So it doesn't make any sense for his check to be the same, or in the same ballpark as if he fights Luis Collazo, if he fights Sean Porter, right? But see, what happens is, you got all these Al Haymon fighters who's gotten used to making this big money by not fighting, big name guys, or not fighting each other. Because you have to think, well, if Keith Thurman, and Sean Porter fight, and Sean Porter's an Al Haymon $1 million fighter, so he's got to make around $1 million too. If Keith Thurman's going to make $1 million, we can't just say, well, Sean Porter, you made $1 million plus from when you fought Adrian Broner. Now, when you fight Keith Thurman, you're a bigger name, an undefeated fighter. You're not going to make the same amount. So you have to say, well, do these fighters feel, I guess, a bit entitled? Getting back to these articles, as I said, at the end of each article, it states that, he's a consultant for HBO. So which means he gets paid by HBO. He's not trying to hide it. One thing he talks about is, and he points out that when PBC first premiered, a lot of people were like, oh, this is going to be big. You got Al Haymon buying all these different dates, paying for all these different channels. He's got all this production value. He's got Layla Ali, Marv Albert, Sugar Ray Leonard. By the way, whatever happened to Layla Ali, I think she was just too outspoken, in my personal opinion. They just, quietly got rid of her. We got PBC that's supposed to be, later on we find out it's supposed to be on ABC. It's supposed to be on ESPN. It's on Bounce TV. It's on CBS. It's on Spike TV. And we're hearing it's supposed to be on later on BET. Everything was hype last year, and we were seeing a lot of fights. But one thing we noticed the trend of, we're seeing all these fights, but we're not seeing A-side versus A-side fights. Now, one thing I did know, they started off pretty good with Keith Thurman versus Robert Guerrero, but at that point in time, even though it was a big fight, we all, knew that Robert Guerrero was going to lose. You had Adrian Broner versus John Molina. And when it comes to other big PBC fights, we had Adrian Broner versus Sean Porter, but those fights come, far, in between each other. So the question is, was PBC going to keep all of this up? Now, when it comes to ratings, it all depends on how you look at it, in my opinion. Now, let me read just one. Let me just read one little excerpt here. Now, I'm going to put all the links to these articles right down below. Okay. The final production meeting for the telecast was held in a meeting room at the MGM Grand. Al came in. This is Al Haymon. A member of the production team recalls there were about 15 to 20 people there. He talked to us about the importance of boxing and his desire to revive interest in the sport. He said that everyone in the room should think of themselves as a part of the team. He didn't talk for long, only a couple of minutes, but he seemed very sincere, like this really mattered to him. The NBC telecast averaged 3.37 million viewers, including 554,000 in the 18 to 34-year-old group, and 1.38 and 1.38 million in the 18 to 49 demographic. It was an encouraging start for an audacious plan backed by an estimated $500 million venture capital. Haymon was planning to revolutionize boxing. Now, there was episodes of The Contender. Remember that show? Sergio Moro was a part of it. Oscar De La Hoya was in the early 2000s or so. They were averaging, for their shows, 8 or so plus million. Even though you have Robert Guerrero, Keith Thurman, Adrian Broner, John Molina fighting in front of the biggest audience of their lives, they've never had 3 million people watching. Still, in the grand scheme of things, and if you do a little bit of research, that number is not very high. And if you look at, since then, numbers have declined. You have to think, when it comes to national television, right? National television, you have an audience of tens of thousands. That means if you don't have cable, you can plug in your television, and if you got the little digital antennas or whatever, you can watch these fights. But 3.37 million, Now, we point out some other things. Let me point out some other things. They talk about how Al Haymon has done all of this with being, a private person, and how him being so private is one of the other aspects of the downfall of PBC. It's okay to be private. I'm a private person in a sense. Even though I'm on here, outside I'm a private person. But it seems as though Al Haymon goes through extra, to extra lengths to be private. He doesn't do any interviews with the media. His last interview about boxing was in like the early 2000s, something like that. He has a small circle. They say it's of about 5 or so people. Of course, one of them is Sam Watson. A lot of people think he's Al Haymon because he's the one that's always with the fighter. Sam Watson is the father of those 2 brothers that people say are twins that are always with the fighters. They're not twins. They're considered, Sam Watson and the Watson brothers are considered to be the representatives of Al Haymon. Not necessarily the spokesperson of the fighters, but they do all the managerial stuff for the fighters and make sure the fighters, kind of like supervisors of the fighters at the events. So they're not just around, they do stuff. They talk about how Al Haymon, when it comes to, the promoters, they say he's so private that he micromanages everything, that events are tough to put together because only Al Haymon knows the plan. So you have the promoters that this article is pointing out are just, they're just the promoter's license. But when it comes to putting together the event, it's Al Haymon and, whoever he uses to put together the event. It said that, promoters can't get like simple stuff done, for promoting the fights because, for one, they may not know who's promoting what fighter. For example, when you have, the articles pointed this out, when you have Danny Garcia, right? who, if he fights on the East Coast, he's promoted by Lou DiBella. But if he fights on the West Coast, he's promoted by, what is that, TGB Promotions or something like that? So what happens is, how does a promoter invest in a fighter for the future? When they don't know, well, I don't know if I'm going to be promoting this fighter for the long term or not. You get me? So how can you further progress a fighter's career if, he doesn't have a promoter? I mean, he doesn't have like a set promoter. And when it comes to PBC and their marketing of the fighters, in my opinion, they're not doing a good job. It almost seems like they're out of touch a little bit. Maybe their staff doesn't watch a lot of boxing. I don't know. It just seems as though with all the technology that they have with the cameras, that's supposed to be on the forehead, and with the presentation and the ramps and all kind of stuff like that, it just seems as though they're missing something. The first PBC telecast, people were saying that this felt like we were watching wrestling. I felt like I was waiting for Ric Flair to come out with a steel chair or some shit. So we pulled out some other things. By the way, I'm T-Street Controversy. This is T-Street Controversy Live. I cover every single major fight live. He hates the unexpected, doesn't like to delegate authority, and micromanages every detail. He gets what he wants and does things the way he wants. Also, the article tries to make Al Haymon seem like he's just this guy who it's his way or the highway. He doesn't like input, and that basically, how can I put it? It try to portray him that he's like this gentle giant, but also he's a jerk in the same way. So it's like, he'll entertain the fact that he'll allow you to present your idea, but he'll know, like, nah, I'm not going to, do anything you say. I'm going to listen to you because it's the polite thing to do, but I'm not going to do anything you say. What I've noticed is it does seem like with the matchmaking that Al Haymon is out of touch a little bit when it comes to his matchmaking. Now you got two types of PBC supporters. Now I can talk about this. You got the PBC supporters because they're like, I don't care what fights he put on. The fighters are getting paid. The brothers are getting paid, and it's a black man running it. So you got those type of supporters. And then you got the PBC supporters who are basically like, oh yeah, we're getting all this free boxing, and ESPN Friday Night Fights was shit. This is the most boxing we had in years. I'm right there, like in the middle of that. But then you got the PBC haters who just want PBC gone, just want PBC just off of television. Now when it comes to the PBC haters, I can understand what they're saying because they feel that Al Haymon is a disease to the sport. They feel that Al Haymon has broken all these rules and he's the reason why we're not getting the best fights. In a way, you have to understand that they have a point to a certain extent, because if Al Haymon wasn't around, would we have this big divide to whereas in Manny Pacquiao is having so many issues getting, fights that are meaningful to sell on pay-per-view. But if Manny Pacquiao would have been able to fight guys like Keith Thurman, Sean Porter, things like that, that would pretty much extend his career. But then again, you have to say, well, who do you blame? Do you blame him? Do you blame Al Haymon? Or do you blame Bob Arum? That's a whole different thing, right? That's a whole, different thing right there. Also, it's this big thing going on where everyone's talking about PBC Premier Boxing Champions is losing all this money. They lost all this money. They put it all in the wrong things. For example, it's in the article too. Read it about how PBC has purchased 2 jets. They have 2 jets for their fighters. How PBC has purchased all this time on these networks, but is not providing the fights. If you've noticed, since last year up until this year, there hasn't really been any PBC fights. Remember when PBC was announced and launched in March? It was announced in January, it launched in March, but we were having consistent fights, consistently going. And you would think a year later that we wouldn't have this gap from January to April 1st. The first PBC card of this year, is April the 1st, and it's Broner versus Theophane. You have to ask, where are those NBC primetime dates? You got Errol Spence versus Chris Algieri. That's good. You got Andre Berto versus Victor Ortiz, PBC on Fox. That's good. But at this point in time, wouldn't you expect like more? And also, you have to think, well, what do the fighters have to say about this? You have Lamont Peterson, who's been saying that he will fight at middleweight to keep active. Should Al Haymon fighters have this issue, of keeping active? And I feel personally that maybe Al Haymon fighters are somewhat, as I said earlier about the Keith Thurman thing, that they're entitled. They're saying, no, I won't fight this fighter unless I get this amount of money. I'm thinking that there may be Al Haymon fighters that won't fight certain fighters because they want $1 million. For example, do you believe that Jamal Charlo, I'm just using an example. I'm not saying these guys are ducking each other. Do you believe that Jamal Charlo and Austin Trout is a fight for both fighters to make $1 million each? It all depends on how you look at it. You can be one of the fans that say, well, shit, all fighters should be making millions of dollars if they're fighting like that. But if you look at the economics of boxing, is that really a multi-million-dollar fight? You get what I'm saying? So I'm going to talk more about this in detail, in my Google Hangout later on tonight. I really have mixed opinions on all of this. I don't feel that PBC is going to fail. I feel that they can right the ship, and by righting the ship, they have to put on more competitive fights. As I was saying earlier in the video, I feel that sometimes it looks like Al Haymon is just completely out of touch with what the hell's going on with bullshit fights that he makes. But then again, you have to ask, well, what if that first year was them testing the waters to say, okay, let's get our fighters out there, and then the next year we're just going to turn up. When you look at some of the uncharacteristic things we've seen, where we're seeing that Dominic Wade, an Al Haymon fighter, is fighting on HBO. There was no problems making that fight. When you look at Amir Khan fighting Canelo Alvarez on HBO pay-per-view, you have to think, well, what if Al Haymon sends Erislandy Lara over to fight Gennady Golovkin? What if he sends a Peter Quillen or Danny Jacobs? Will fans start saying, okay, all right, I see what he's doing? But right now, you just don't know what's going on. Another thing they pointed out is that there are there's no specific person who speaks for PBC. The fights that they have don't really go nowhere. You can see Adrian Broner, fighting Ashley Theophane, but where does it lead to? You see Adonis Stevenson fights Saki Obika. What does it lead to? You see him fight Tommy Karpinski. What does it lead to? You get me? Their fights don't really lead to nothing. And as they said in the article, I forgot how they said it. I'm going to try to quote it. They said something like, damn, I forgot what they said. But it's like, to me, I'm going to use my own little phrase. It's like having an appetizer. Like, okay, well, when's dinner coming? For example, what does Danny Garcia versus Robert Guerrero lead to? Did we know that Danny Garcia, if he would have beat Paulie Malignaggi, which he did, would that have led to Robert Guerrero? They need somebody like Richard Schaefer used to be, where, I'm not saying Richard Schaefer, and we're going to get to him in part 2 of this video. I'm going to do another one. Where he was saying that he would have been more open with the media. And remember, Richard Schaefer, whether you like the things he said or not, he was open with the media. And he used to say shit like, well, if this person beats this person, they'll likely fight that person and build up to probably doing this, and we'll get this, But when it comes to PBC, there's nobody that does that. Because the promoters can't do it, because they don't know if they're going to be promoting the next fighter's fight or not. So I'm going to do my own little bit of a episodic thing here, where this is going to be just part 1, and in my second part, I actually wrote down a bunch of quotes from Richard Schaefer that I'm going to quote and we're going to talk about. This video was kind of just a summation of everything that's going on. And then in my next video, I'm going to go into more detail. I'm not going to do 5 videos just like the 5 articles, but I'm going to do videos just to pretty much touch on everything that's wrong with PBC right now and what they can do to change things. I'm T Street Controversy. This is T Street Controversy Live. I cover every single major fight live. Please subscribe.